There's something sitting in a museum in Oregon right now that most people walk right past without a second glance. A pair of sandals. Battered, woven, falling apart at the edges. They look like something you'd sweep off a garage floor. But those sandals are over 10,000 years old. Someone made them, wore them out, and tossed them aside like an old paper cup, and they survived anyway. And the story of how we got from those sandals to the shoes on your feet right now is one of the strangest, most revealing journeys in all of human history. It starts, like most things do, with bare skin on raw earth. For hundreds of thousands of years, that's all there was. No leather, no stitching, no sole, just the human foot doing what it was built to do. And here's what most people don't realize: the foot is an extraordinary piece of engineering. 26 bones, 33 joints, a natural arch system that absorbs impact the way a suspension bridge handles load. People who grow up walking barefoot their whole lives develop calluses so thick, so dense, that the bottom of the foot becomes its own shoe, tough as leather, flexible, responsive. The human body, given enough time and enough rough ground, builds its own protection, but then something changed. Around 40,000 years ago, and we know this not from any artifact, but from human bones, the toe bones of our ancestors started getting thinner. Smaller. Weaker. Because they no longer needed to grip the ground the way a barefoot walker does. That thinning is the first evidence we have that humans had started wrapping their feet in something. Not a shoe exactly. But something. Hides, bark, wrapped grass, woven reeds. The foot was being protected, and the body stopped doing the work itself. It's one of the earliest examples of a tool changing human biology, and we can read it in the skeleton like a confession. The oldest actual footwear ever found came out of a cave in Oregon in 1938, buried under layers of volcanic ash. Sandals woven from sagebrush bark, carefully twined, surprisingly sophisticated. 10,000 years old. And the thing that strikes you about them isn't how primitive they look, it's how ordinary. They were worn down. Discarded. Everyday objects that someone tossed out when they wore through. The same way you pitch a pair of flip-flops. Across the Pacific, in an Armenian cave sealed under sheep dung for millennia, archaeologists found an even more striking object, a single leather shoe, 5,500 years old. One piece of cowhide, laced up, stuffed with dry grass for cushioning. It fit a modern size 7. You could hold it in your hands and understand it immediately, the way you'd understand a coffee mug or a butter knife. But the find that really stops people cold is Ötzi the Iceman. A man who died in the Alps around 3300 BC, frozen perfectly in a glacier, preserved so completely that scientists have analyzed his last meal. And his boots were extraordinary. Bearskin soles for durability. Deerskin uppers for flexibility. Bark netting stuffed with dried grass for insulation. A modern researcher once built an exact replica from the same materials and hiked 12 miles in them, not a single blister. Warmer and more comfortable, he said, than his modern hiking boots. A man who died 5,000 years ago had figured out alpine footwear better than most of what we sold in sporting goods stores a generation ago. Now, as long as shoes were just about survival, just about keeping the foot intact on difficult ground, they stayed relatively simple. But the moment civilization arrived, the moment you had cities and kings and grain surplus and people who didn't have to work with their hands, shoes became something else entirely. They became a language. A code. A way of announcing exactly who you were without saying a word. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh's sandals were gilded. Literal gold. King Tutankhamun was buried with more than 80 pairs. Meanwhile, the common farmer wore sandals woven from papyrus, cheap, quick, disposable. And slaves wore nothing at all, because in Egyptian society, as in Greek and Roman society, bare feet weren't just inconvenient. They were a legal status. Barefoot meant you were property. Barefoot meant you had no standing, literally or otherwise. In Rome, this was actually codified into law. Free citizens wore a specific enclosed leather shoe. Soldiers marched in iron-studded sandals heavy enough to do real damage in close combat. Stomping was a legitimate battlefield tactic. And if you appeared in public barefoot in Rome, everyone around you already knew what that meant. You belonged to someone else. Medieval Europe added its own chapter, and it's one of the stranger ones. The streets of medieval cities were genuinely horrifying: open sewage, animal waste, rotting refuse packed into narrow lanes between buildings that blocked the sun. Walking through it was not just unpleasant but dangerous. So people began wearing wooden platforms strapped to their feet, elevating themselves above the filth. They were called pattens, and they clattered on cobblestones and caught on everything, but they kept your real shoes clean, and in a world where shoes were expensive, keeping them clean mattered. Then fashion got involved, and things went completely sideways. Sometime in the 14th century, the pointed-toe shoe became fashionable in European courts. Not slightly pointed, absurdly pointed. Grotesquely pointed. Shoes with empty tips stretching 6 inches beyond the actual foot, curling upward like a jester's prop. They were called poulaines, and the length of the point told you everything about the wearer's status. Because only someone who never had to work, never had to run, never had to do anything physically demanding, could afford to walk around in shoes that made walking almost impossible. The longer the toe, the richer and more idle the life. Eventually things got so extreme that kings passed sumptuary laws, actual legislation limiting how long a commoner's shoe tip could be. The nobility, naturally, exempted themselves. Then came the industrial age, and with it one of the strangest details in the whole history of shoes, a detail that almost nobody knows. For several centuries, left and right shoes simply didn't exist. Shoemakers, trying to keep up with growing populations and rising demand, abandoned the distinction entirely. They made identical shoes, straight-lasted, mirror images of nothing in particular, and sold them in pairs. You bought 2 of the same shoe, put one on each foot, and alternated them daily so they'd wear down evenly. That was the solution. Centuries of that. People walked in shoes that fit neither foot correctly and considered it perfectly normal, because they'd never known anything else. The left and right shoe came back in the early 1800s, and it felt like a revelation. But the real transformation came from a man most Americans have never heard of. Jan Ernst Maat-Salinger, the son of a Dutch engineer and a Surinamese mother, arrived in Lynn, Massachusetts in the 1870s with almost nothing. Lynn was the shoe capital of America, and the one step that kept production limited, the one thing no machine could do, was lasting. Pulling leather over a wooden foot form and nailing it precisely to the sole required a craftsman's hands, years of training, feel and judgment that resisted mechanization. A skilled laster could finish 50 pairs a day. No more. Maat-Salinger spent years in a rented room, working by lamplight, building a machine that could replicate those hand movements, the pull, the stretch, the positioning, the nail. In 1883, he patented it. His lasting machine produced 700 pairs a day. The price of shoes across America dropped by half almost overnight. For the first time in human history, a working family could afford to own more than 1 pair of shoes. The foot, for the first time, had truly been democratized, which brings us to right now. Today, somewhere around 1 billion people on Earth still walk barefoot, not by choice, but because they cannot afford shoes. Meanwhile, in American sporting goods stores and on wellness websites, you can spend $200 on a minimalist shoe specifically engineered to replicate the natural mechanics of the human barefoot, to restore the exact gait, the exact pressure distribution, the exact relationship between foot and ground that our ancestors had for free, without thinking about it, for 100,000 years. From a pair of sagebrush sandals left in an Oregon cave to luxury footwear designed to make you feel like you're wearing nothing at all. The whole history of the human foot is right there, in that one strange circle.